In the Luo village of Kanyachkachar, nestled on the edge of Lake Victoria, there was a tranquility that settled in the hearts of its people. The sun rose over the shimmering waters, casting golden rays on the land. The villagers, small in number but large in spirit, lived off the fertile land, planting crops that had been cultivated by their ancestors. They fished in the lake, the water flowing with life and stories that had been passed down for generations. Each day followed a rhythm. In the mornings, the men would set out in their boats, casting their nets into the waters, while the women worked the fields, bending their backs to the earth. In the evenings, the familiar sound of the nyatiti, a traditional Luo instrument, would fill the air. Its melodies were like a thread weaving the fabric of the village together. The music was the village's heartbeat, the rhythm that connected them to the past and to each other. Nights in the village were peaceful. People gathered under the ancient osok tree, where the elders would sit and share stories of ancestors long gone, of gods and spirits, and of the strength of the people who had built the village. The stars above seemed to hold the stories in place as if they too were listening. But on one fateful night, that peace was shattered. Inside a modest thatched hut, Akinyi, a woman in the full bloom of motherhood, lay in labor. Her face contorted in pain, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The moonlight outside seemed to shine brighter, casting long, eerie shadows. Akinyi's cries echoed through the night, breaking the silence that had so long reigned in the village. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but there was something else, something she couldn't name, that gnawed at her. The village midwife, Nyamweya, was the first to answer the call. She had helped bring many children into the world and had never once faltered in her duty. But tonight, something was different. The night felt heavy, laden with an unspoken dread. Nyamweya tried to calm her nerves, muttering words of prayer as she moved around the hut. The flickering lanterns cast shadows on the walls, as though the very ancestors themselves were watching, waiting. "Ancestors, guide me," Nyamweya whispered, her hands trembling as she assisted Akinyi. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy, as though something was pressing down on them from above. The cries of Akinyi grew louder, echoing through the hut, and for a moment, Nyamweya thought she heard a strange, almost unnatural sound beneath the cries, a low hum that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She paused, looked up at the ceiling, and then back at Akinyi. The woman's face was pale with pain, her eyes wide and full of fear. And then, the child was born. But when the baby's first cry split the air, it was unlike any cry Nyamweya had ever heard. It was sharp, echoing, and somehow hollow, as if it came from somewhere deep in the earth. Nyamweya froze, her hands trembling. She looked down at the newborn. The baby's skin was pale, its limbs twisted in a way that no child's limbs should twist. It was as though something had gone horribly wrong. Nyamweya's heart raced. "No, it cannot be," she gasped, stumbling backward, her mind reeling. Her voice, usually steady, was now a whisper full of fear. What she saw before her was not just a child. It was something unnatural. Outside, the village was starting to stir. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of whispers, of fear. The lanterns flickered in the dark as the villagers began to gather around Akinyi's hut, their faces full of dread, but no one dared to speak aloud. What they had heard was enough. There was something wrong, something that didn't belong. Mzee Odhiambo, the wise village elder, was the first to arrive. He had seen many things in his time, and his mind was sharp. But tonight even he felt the weight of something dark in the air. He approached the hut with caution, as though he were afraid of disturbing whatever malevolent force had descended on the village. He scanned the surroundings looking for any sign of disturbance, but found none. Yet, the air felt thick, oppressive. "Return to your homes," Mzee Odhiambo said in a voice full of authority. "This is no place for fear." His words carried weight, but they didn't ease the villagers' minds. In fact, it only seemed to make them more uneasy. The elder turned and left, his footsteps slow and deliberate, but even he could not shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding. The days that followed were filled with whispers. Akinyi and her newborn stayed secluded in her hut, but the villagers could not stay away. The rumors spread like wildfire. Strange cries echoed from the hut at night, low, haunting wails that carried on the wind. Some said it was the voice of a spirit. Others claimed it was the child calling for its mother, while some simply whispered that it was the work of dark forces. Akinyi's face became drawn, her body growing weaker as the weight of the rumors pressed down on her. She avoided the villagers, her once proud and confident steps now reduced to fearful shuffles. She could hear their voices from the windows, their harsh words laced with suspicion. "It's not a baby," one elder whispered. "It's an omen," another murmured. The drought continued to ravage the land and the crops failed. The villagers, once filled with the strength of the land, were now divided, torn between fear and guilt. Tensions rose. The once peaceful village was now fraught with suspicion and blame. Who would they point to? Who would they blame for the drought? One evening, as the villagers gathered under the osok tree, their faces grim in the lantern light, Nyamweya stepped forward. She had seen things no one else had seen, and now she could no longer stay silent. "I saw it with my own eyes," she said, her voice trembling. "The child is unnatural." The words hung in the air and the villagers stared at her in silence, each of them wondering what that could possibly mean. "I have seen creatures in the wild, in the depths of the forest, but this is different." Her words were met with silence, but deep in their hearts the villagers knew the truth. The fear had taken root. Even Mz Odiambo was no longer sure of what he believed. Could this be the work of the spirits? Could the child truly be cursed? The turning point came on a bright afternoon. The children of the village were playing a game of hide and seek, laughing and running through the fields. Little Awiti, always the adventurous one, darted toward the forbidden hut, eager to prove her bravery. The others watched in silence, sensing the danger but too afraid to speak. Moments later, the laughter stopped, replaced by a blood-curdling scream that sent chills through the hearts of everyone who heard it. Awiti stumbled out of the hut, her face pale with terror. She was gasping for breath, her eyes wide and filled with dread. "There's a monster inside," she cried, pointing back toward the hut. The villagers rushed forward, their hearts racing. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, sickles, spears, and pitchforks. Fear had taken hold, and nothing would stand in their way. Akinyi emerged from the hut, cradling her child to her chest. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "He's just a baby." But the crowd was no longer listening. The fear had overtaken them. The child was a monster, and it had to be destroyed. The elders convened, their faces solemn beneath the flickering light of the lanterns. Their decision was swift, their words final. "The child is cursed," one elder declared, his voice shaking with conviction. "To save the village, it must be destroyed." Akinyi fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I am not a witch," she cried. "He is my son, my blood." But it was too late. The villagers had made up their minds. They couldn't undo the fear that had already taken hold of their hearts. The child, with its twisted body, 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 heads, was an omen, something that must be eradicated before it could bring doom to the village. But then, from the shadows, a voice spoke out. Omondi, the young healer who had always believed in the power of knowledge, stepped forward. His heart was heavy, his resolve firm. "This is not a curse," Omondi said, his voice carrying the weight of truth. "It's a medical condition, not something born of darkness." He stepped closer to the villagers, his eyes full of passion. "This child is not evil. It's a gift, not a punishment. The villagers scoffed at him, their fear blinding them to reason. They ignored Omondi's plea and, in their haste to rid themselves of the monster, they locked Akinyi and her child in a hut, waiting for the end to come. As night fell, Omondi hatched a daring plan. He approached the guards and slipped them food laced with sleeping herbs, silently slipping through the night like a shadow. The guards fell into a deep sleep, and Omondi quickly led Akinyi and her child to the river, where a small canoe awaited. "Go," Omondi urged. "Find safety." Akinyi hesitated, her face full of tears. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Because fear does not define us," Omondi replied. "Go." With a final glance at the village that had once been home, Akinyi and her child disappeared into the night, their future uncertain, but hopeful. Akinyi's journey was not an easy one. The path was uncertain, darkened by the cloud of fear that still loomed over her. With Omondi's help, she and her child traveled in secret, crossing through forests, rivers, and rugged terrain. Every night she prayed for their safety, for peace, for understanding. But there was little rest for the weary, as the night was filled with the same fears that had consumed Kanyach-Kachar. The village that had once been her home was a far-off memory, but the shadows of its rejection clung to her. Her child, with his twisted form, had been cast out, branded as a curse. Yet, in the deep recesses of her heart, she knew he was no monster. He was her son, her flesh and blood. But there was hope. Akinyi found refuge in a distant town, a place where strangers spoke in a language she did not understand, but where the air felt different, less heavy. There, in that new place, she encountered a group of traveling doctors who listened to her story. They did not look at her with fear. They did not flinch when they saw her child. Instead, they approached with curiosity, compassion, and a desire to help. The doctors quickly diagnosed the child. His condition was rare, a medical anomaly that could be treated with careful attention. It wasn't a curse, but rather a condition that, with the right care, could allow him to live a healthy, fulfilling life. Weeks turned into months, and the doctors worked tirelessly. They tended to the child, nurturing him and ensuring his health. Akinyi, though still haunted by the memory of her village's rejection, found a renewed sense of hope. Her son was improving. He was not cursed. He was not a monster. He was a child with an extraordinary condition, but a child nonetheless. But in Kanyach-Kachar, things were not so simple. The drought continued to ravage the land, and the villagers grew more desperate. Guilt weighed heavily on the hearts of the people who had condemned Akinyi and her child. They had been so quick to label them as cursed, but now, with the drought persisting and their crops failing, they began to wonder if their decision had been wrong. As the months dragged on, the villagers could feel the pressure mounting. They could not shake the feeling that the guilt of their actions was at the heart of the village's misfortune. Mzee Odiambo, once so sure of his judgment, now found himself questioning everything. Had they truly been justified in their fears, or had they been blinded by superstition? It was then, on a clear and quiet morning, that the village received a surprising visitor. Akinyi had returned. The villagers gathered in the square, whispers rippling through the crowd. Mzee Odiambo stood at the front, his face full of solemnity. Akinyi, wearing clothes that were not of the village, stepped forward, her face tired but resolute. And beside her, to the astonishment of everyone, stood the very child they had once condemned. He was no longer the twisted, sickly child they had feared, his twin brother. The once monstrous figure of the two-headed child had transformed. The medical treatment had worked, and he was now a picture of life and vitality. The villagers stared in stunned silence. The guilt and fear that had defined their perception of the child now hung heavily in the air. How could they have been so blind? The doctors who had treated the child were also present. They spoke calmly, explaining the rare but treatable condition that had affected Akinyi's son. That evening, under the osok tree, the villagers gathered once more. This time there were no tales of fear or curses. Instead, there were stories of healing, of knowledge, and of the strength it took to overcome fear. They shared in their newfound understanding, vowing never again to allow fear to cloud their judgment. They would welcome knowledge. They would embrace compassion. They would understand before they acted. The sun set over Lake Victoria, casting a warm glow over the village. The lake, once a symbol of the villagers' deep connection to their ancestors, now felt like a place of renewal. Kanyach had begun to heal. It was no longer a village bound by fear, but one that had learned the true meaning of strength. Akinyi and her children, now free from the weight of rejection, stayed in the village, but their lives had been irrevocably changed. The child that had once been seen as a monster was now celebrated for the strength he represented. His story, and the story of his mother's courage, would be told for generations. And so, Kanyach thrived once again, not just in the harvests they gathered, but in the lessons they learned. The lesson that true strength lies not in tradition alone, but in the courage to face what we do not understand, and the willingness to